So in this video, I want to carry on with Alistair MacIntyre. I'm looking at After Virtue, the third edition. And what I'm looking at is chapter 1, a disquieting suggestion. And in this one, he performs a thought experiment, which is something that, it's an imaginary experiment. And he tries to show that the state that exists in this imaginary experiment is very much the state that we're in now with respect to something different. In the imaginary experiment, it's respect to science, and in reality, MacIntyre thinks the same thing is going on with respect to morality. And then he's going to draw the main thesis of his book out of this contrast and this similarity between this imagined experiment and what he thinks the real situation in morality today is. Okay, so let's dig in. So the thought experiment is something right out of science fiction. As I mentioned in a previous video, MacIntyre does refer to an actual existing novel, a great novel called A Canticle for Leibowitz. What this novel was essentially about the destruction of science, and then a group of monks, as they still use the terms of science and try to piece it back together, much like what happened after the supposed loss of the knowledge of antiquity, and the medieval monks trying to piece these things back together in their scriptoria. All right, so what's going on here? So imagine that all of our scientific knowledge is not particularly lost, but shattered. In other words, this notion of science as a giant conceptual scheme where the parts all fit together, both in terms of theory and in terms of practice, imagine that's been shattered. And an anti-science movement has arisen. I mean, science fiction is full of this kind of stuff, of the reaction to science. And so what's this anti-science fiction movement, or anti-science movement, done in science fiction novels and in MacIntyre's thought experiment? Well, basically, it's eliminated all kinds of things. Laboratories aren't functioning, so the labs aren't functioning anymore. Scientists aren't properly in labs of any kind. There really aren't scientists anymore. There's no training. The university system has broken down. Scientific books have been, ripped up largely, kind of gutted. But there might be a chapter here, or maybe part of a chapter, or a page there, so that the people that are left would have a page of equations, and they wouldn't have the context of what it was really about or how it related to other things, but just a sheet of equations. And then, so science wouldn't be taught in any way. It might be just passed on, in this incoherent fashion by just word of mouth. And that's exactly what's in the novel A Canticle for Leibowitz. That's what these monks do, right? They have just sheets of leftover books that, let's say, equations and other things that people wrote, like laundry lists. And so how does this emerging civilization of these monks relate to this decontextualized, shattered system of knowledge that was previously called science? So imagine that. So so go ahead and read that novel. It's a good way to read it before you dig into this. It gives you a good, really vivid flavor, because Miller, the guy who wrote it, is such a good writer. So fragments remain. You have experiments with no explanatory framework. Just people, well, you boiled this or you did this, and what was the purpose of that? And there's nothing left. Just bits of theories, odd bits of pieces of scientific instruments, etc. Portions, uses of these things have all been forgotten. And these vestiges, are just dubbed, right? Well, we'll call that, so that seems to be about living things. So we'll call that biology. And this seems to be about moving stuff. So maybe we'll call that physics. This seems to be about, certain kinds of reactions and boilings and stuff. And we'll call that chemistry. So you have partially informed people. They start arguing this stuff. So knowledge is starting to, humans are naturally, we gravitate towards trying to discover things and link things together. So phlogiston theory comes back in a weird form, relativity theory, and all these things start to come back, but they're all, haphazardly organized as people struggle to try and figure out the original patterns of these things. But it's pretty hard to figure out the original pattern when you have no idea how this stuff fit together. It'd be like, being thrown a box of jigsaw puzzle pieces where lots of them are missing and you have no picture and you're told to put it all together. And so some things might kind of fit together, but the shape might fit together, but they don't fit together according to the original picture. So those of you who've done jigsaw puzzles, there's a lot of things going on when you try to put them together, and you need some kind of blueprint. There's none of that. That's all gone. The blueprint has been blown to smithereens. All right. So what happens? Well, in this shattered scientific framework, children learn surviving portions. They would just memorize, equations, not knowing really what they meant. Maybe some of Euclid's theorems, again, just memorizing them, but not having lost all of the general structure of Euclidean geometry. And so, there's certain canons of consistency and coherence start to arise, but nobody really knows the context of all this stuff because it's all missing. Now, what's important here is that people continue to use the language of natural science in this shattered system. People are still using words like, microscopes and planets and stars and elements and points and sets of mathematics and whatnot. But they're largely, because of everything's been shattered, it's decontextualized. And so, in this sense, science is shattered. Vestiges remain in a variety of ways. The context is gone. Scientific terms, they're still being used. And MacIntyre calls this thought experiment, a state of cognitive disorder. And he thinks, so this is now as you sort of primed your intuitions with this neat little thought experiment. He thinks our morality, the morality of today, like when we talk about morality, philosophers and everybody, when we're talking about morality today, he thinks it's currently in this kind of a shattered state. He calls it a moral disorder. And that's what this book is unpacking, right? It's going to go into how did this moral disorder come about. He wants to tell this story. And not only does he want to tell the story of the emergence of moral disorder in moral thinking and moral conversations and all this stuff. So how did this moral disorder arise, and what do we do about it? So in a nutshell, what's After Virtue about? It's the rise of a kind of a moral disorder in our language and what we should do about it, and why traditional philosophies, some of them are not going to work, but he's going to find one that does, and not surprising, it's a form of Aristotelianism. So he's going to locate when this moral disorder sort of erupted, and we've got to look back before the emergence of the moral disorder to an earlier time. So yeah, it's some people have said it's conservatism, it's nostalgia, whatever you want to call it, but let's just avoid all the names and look at what MacIntyre is trying to do, because it's very, very interesting and certainly important. This is a key book in ethics in the last 40-ish years. All right, so let's continue. So MacIntyre says, well, with this moral disorder, so it's, people are still using terms and stuff out of history, like morality and moral laws. You're all used to talking about principles of morality and all that. MacIntyre thinks that you're in the situation of these people. You're using terms that have been gutted of their context or stripped of their context, but you're still using them. You talk about moral laws, but laws imply lawmakers. Well, who's the lawmaker, right? So this kind of stuff, and it used to be traditionally kind of like God or something. And MacIntyre is saying, we're using these things these terms, moral terms, in a decontextualized sense. I mean, this goes back, this idea of the decontextualization of moral terms and their continued use, and the problematic nature of using moral terms that have been decontextualized. Of course, you find this much earlier in the thought and analysis of Elizabeth Anscombe, right? So it's kind of a shame that that's not credited here, but it should be, because she was talking about this a long time before MacIntyre was. In any case, so that's a bit of interesting history of philosophy there. So, okay, so now if we look at this moral disorder, and MacIntyre says, okay, if you were to bring in philosophy, history, and their tools to examine this moral disorder, because he admits it's a startling thesis. He says that over and over again. Yeah, you might find it tough to believe, and my job, says MacIntyre, is to motivate you to believe that we are in this moral disorder. He says if we bring in, and he's going to flesh all this out, but we're just in the first chapter, so we have to cut him some slack. What would we get if we brought in philosophy, history, and their tools to examine this moral disorder? Well, he says if you bring in analytic philosophy, so I'm just using the simplified here to symbolize philosophy, he says it's going to be largely useless, right? Analytic philosophy will analyze language. It won't basically perceive the disorder. It won't get to the root of it because it just uses the language of the present, and it's looking at how terms are used. So it's not going to be able to dig out and unearth this context, or even this lost context, that is, or even be able to say that the fact is there is a lost context. It'll just tell you about how the terms relate to each other as is. This is probably a little bit of a simplification of analytic philosophy to just say that it will be useless and it just looks at how terms relate to each other. That's debatable. But anyways, MacIntyre's point is that if you really just do linguistic analysis of terms, you're not going to get the historical story in that sense. So in one way, and MacIntyre might be implicitly drawing making a contrast between sort of a linguistic analysis of how terms are actually used in a certain milieu or at a certain time, and philology, which would be more interested in trying to look at the development and change in meanings of terms over time. MacIntyre probably would deny that even that could be seriously done. But how is he going to do it? Well, that'll come later. So analytic philosophy, not going to help us out. Phenomenological philosophy, yeah, same thing. It's going to be pretty useless. Why? Because the structure in phenomenological philosophy, it looks at intentionality to a great degree, right? The structures of how experience works. And one of the things that's fundamental in phenomenology is intentionality. And of course, that's a mare's nest of how you argue and define what that is, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is that phenomenological philosophy is not really going to help us either, because the structures of intentionality remain the same throughout this moral disorder prior to it and after. So it's not going to unearth this either or help us learn more about it. Third thing, modern academic history. So remember, not history as in looking at history, as in what actually happened, but the tools of the trade that modern historians use. MacIntyre says it's not going to allow you to see this disorder either. Well, why? Because modern, again, and this, MacIntyre hasn't clarified, what he means by modern, early, et cetera, et cetera. That'll come clear in the book. But think of it this way, that, this kind of disaster that in the thought experiment, right, this sort of disaster of moral disorder happened at a certain period of time. And so what MacIntyre is saying, well, the techniques of modern academic history, they were developed, right? Here's the disaster. Everything is shattered in the moral talk. It gets shattered. And then after, the techniques of modern academic history are designed and articulated and put into practice. So MacIntyre says that since they are sort of after effects and after this moral disorder, it's disciplinary foundations, right? So it's very epistemology. So the underpinning of the epistemology framework that underlies the techniques of modern history were formed post moral disorder. So they're not going to detect it, right? It's almost embedded right in them. So you're not going to see it using these techniques. And so MacIntyre then says, well, look, his basic hypothesis, right? It's interesting. He's putting forward this historical hypothesis, and he wants to make the case for it throughout this book. And the solution, right? Like what went wrong and his solution is that in the actual world that we inhabit, the language of morality it's like this. It's shattered. It's been all broken up, decontextualized, but continues to be used, right? And in these sort of remnants. And so it's in the same state of grave disorder as the natural science is in this imaginary world. Left are but fragments of a conceptual scheme, parts which now lack the context from which their significance, right, their meaning really derive from. So you're using terms, you're using them, but they're divorced of all of their original meaning. So there's been a loss, right? And in that sense, MacIntyre says we continue to use key expressions, key moral expressions, but we've lost our theoretical and practical comprehension of morality. So there has been this kind of moral catastrophe, right? Not in the sense that people did wrong stuff, but this breakup, right, of morality, and it hasn't been put back together again, because it largely is, and he's going to tie it back to the Enlightenment, that this was a failed, ultimately sort of an explosion, and then people tried to put things back together. In other words, tried to justify foundations. That's all failed, and we're still in a situation of fragmentation and failure when it comes to our moral language. Okay, so what exactly is he talking about here? Like, let's get beyond sort of this rhetoric. What is he talking about, and what does he mean about trying to put it all back together? And so what is his solution going to be? Well, that's what the job of this book is to do. So right in your first chapter, he set it all up, that this is a major project on the history of Western moral thought. Not completely all of the history, but a catastrophe that happened and his solution to fix it.